Okay, today we're going to talk about compost. We're going to talk all about compost, what it is, how it's made, and some general advice on how to make it either on a small scale or on a grand scale. In general, compost is the creation of the organic part of soil. And in a horticultural setting, the ability to create or really just facilitate the creation of compost is a valuable skill. It can solve many soil issues, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So here we go with our introduction to compost. So a simplified definition. Compost is organic matter that has been decomposed in a process called composting. Basically, you make a pile of wet organic matter and you wait for it to break down into humus, or basically just small little pieces of organic matter. This is a natural process. It will happen on its own. But when you do composting, you are creating the optimal conditions for decomposition. And so all the ingredients and the advice and recommendations for composting is just about creating the proper habitat for the decomposing organisms to break down organic material. If we compare and contrast that to decomposition, the natural process, decomposition is much more slow, and it's dependent on the local environmental conditions. And basically, it's what takes place all over the planet all the time. If it didn't happen, then we would be covered in old, dead organic material, leaves, twigs, animal bodies and bones and all kinds of stuff. Where does it go? It gets decomposed. And so it's a natural process by which organic substances are broken down into simpler organic matter. It's part of the nutrient cycle. It is essential for recycling finite matter on Earth. This is how we make new material available for new life. Without decomposition, there could be no new life. The organisms that do this process are known as decomposers. So this is kind of Earth's recycling system, taking living things, and once they're no longer living, converting them back into a form that makes them available for new living things. So composting is different because composting is a process that is managed by humans. It involves the cultivation of microorganisms that degrade and transform organic materials while in the presence of oxygen. So basically, people are creating the proper conditions. We are not making decomposition go faster than it would in nature. We're just making it go full speed, as fast as possible. And one of the things we do when we create those conditions is we help to select which decomposing organisms arrive to the compost pile. And based on how we manipulate the environmental conditions, we can invite certain decomposers. For example, rats are going to be decomposers if they eat rotten food and then, they turn it into manure. But usually that's something we don't want to encourage in the human-built landscape. So we select different organisms, usually microorganisms, that break down this material and make it available again. There's two primary goals that the average composter has. One is to reduce waste, waste going to the landfill in particular, and the other is to build healthy soil. And if your goal is both, then compost will solve your problems. If your goal is only one or the other, then you may make some different choices with your composting in order to either maximize the waste reduction potential or maximize the healthy soil potential. What are the benefits of compost? Well, they are many. Ultimately, compost enriches the soil. it adds organic material, which we know is an important component of healthy soil. In particular, it improves fertility. You think about it, compost is broken down plants, and those are plants that grew. They grew successfully, and so they contained all of the essential elements that plants need. If they didn't, they wouldn't be there. And so we can return those essential elements back to the soil in the form of compost. Compost will help to suppress plant diseases because it helps to make sure your plants are healthy. Healthy plants can fight off disease. Similarly, healthy plants can discourage insect pests. Organic matter in the soil will increase water retention. The moisture holding capacity of the soil is greatly improved when you have organic matter. It acts like a sponge, so it absorbs moisture and swells, and it also helps to form good structure so that whether you have sandy soil or clay soil, the compost will help to keep the water at the root zone in the proper area. It inoculates the soil with beneficial microbes that will continue to go through their processes in the landscape. And so decomposition will happen naturally over time, and you'll have a rich diversity of microorganisms. And those microorganisms are part of the process that unlocks the minerals and makes them available to your plants. It can reduce or even eliminate the need for synthetic fertilizer or even additional organic fertilizer amendments, depending on your cropping system. If you're in intense cultivation, you may need to do some additional fertilization. But if you are in sort of a horticultural landscape, kind of trees and shrubs type of a setting, then oftentimes compost is really all you need. It helps to moderate soil temperature. You can apply this on the surface like a mulch. You can work it into the top 6 inches of the soil layer. And either way, it's going to help prevent the soil from heating up or cooling down excessively, which will keep your plants healthier and the life in the soil healthier. Additionally, composting prevents pollution because otherwise that material, the organic material, would be sent to the landfill. Landfill causes air pollution because the organic matter breaks down without oxygen and creates methane gas. At the very best, it creates CO2, and we want to keep both of those carbon molecules out of the atmosphere. So when it comes to preventing pollution, we're reducing methane production in landfills. We're reducing or eliminating organic garbage. We're reducing or eliminating sewage or organic in the wastewater. Compost can help to degrade toxic chemicals, break them back down into forms that are no longer harmful. Compost can even bind with heavy metals and make them so they aren't available or water soluble. Compost can clean contaminated air. It can clean stormwater runoff. Both of these, if we pass the material, air or water, through a filter of compost, the compost will act similar to like a charcoal filter, and it will bind to any pollutants that can be potentially harmful. So you can pass air or water through compost, and it treats that material and can remove harmful contaminants. And finally, compost can help to restore the land if topsoil and organic matter has been lost. It can help to destroy pathogens, and it can save you money, because without the work that compost does, and you want to grow some plants, you're going to have to do that in other ways. And it's going to take you time, money, energy, material. Compost does it naturally. So let's talk about the general ingredients of compost, how to make it. Typically, you need 4 things. You want high nitrogen material. And what that is the greens. So everything that still has moisture and it came from a plant. It could have come from an animal as well, but usually we focus on composting plant material. So they call it green because it's plant material. We also like to have high carbon material. which we would call the browns. That's the dried up plant material, and that has its own function. In particular, the carbon has the energy. And also, when you have a good mix of high nitrogen, high carbon material, you tend to also have a good balance of the other two ingredients, which are air and water. And both of those are necessary for the living organisms to do the decomposition. And you want about a 50-50 balance of air and water in the pore spaces. And then you could kind of play with the ratio of greens and browns, but you start out 50-50 and you adjust there as needed. So let's look at those ingredients in detail. First, we'll talk about water. Water is important. It maintains activity without causing anaerobic conditions. And water will be lost over time to evaporation. You will even lose some water down to gravity. Gravitational water will pull it down into the soil below, which is why I always recommend composting on the ground, because it actually allows that excess water to leak down into the soil. Now, if you're losing too much water down into the soil, you want to be cautious. You might be leaching material down to the groundwater, which you don't want to do. There's a slight chance for pollution if you get onto a big enough scale. In general, you're going to lose the water, though, to evaporation. It's going to dry out in the pile over time, and we need to add water. The water can be added directly with a hose, or it can be added in the material itself. So if you apply fresh residue plant material, that living plant material is going to have moisture and water. And so you're always checking the water content, and it's good to see some water between the fingers. But if water is dripping out of your hand, that's too much. So you make sure it's wet enough for it to stay wet when you squeeze it, but you don't want drops to be dripping out. Typically, we use the analogy of a wrung out sponge. We want it to look and feel like a wrung out sponge, not dripping any drops, so not saturated, but wet throughout, no dry spots. And then we balance the water with oxygen, or really just air in general, but the important piece is the oxygen. Oxygen oxidizes the carbon in the decomposition process, and it enables the aerobic bacteria to live in the pile, and they are the primary organism that will produce heat. So the oxygen is important for the living things and to enable the material to break down properly. It's really kind of part of the energy system of the compost pile. It's needed as part of the metabolism of the organisms. And the primary way to get oxygen into a compost pile is to turn the pile. On a small scale, that's usually done by hand. On a large scale, that will be done with machines. But either way, you're making sure you incorporate oxygen into the compost pile. You can potentially build the pile in such a way that you don't need to turn very often, if at all. Sometimes people will make a donut shape and leave a pipe in the middle so that air can flow all the way throughout. Some people like to stack thick branches on the bottom to try to keep sort of a gap between the soil and the compost pile, also helping to bring oxygen. Or on a large scale, some commercial compost production even will put a pipe with a blower attached to it and literally use energy to pump oxygen into the center of the pile, which gets rid of the need to turn the compost pile and helps to ensure that you don't have any areas that are anaerobic. The carbon material, the high carbon material, is the brown stuff. It's needed for energy, and the microbial oxidation of carbon produces heat, and high carbon materials tend to be brown and dry. You can see a list of them there, a bullet point list. There's all kinds of material that can act like a high carbon material in the compost pile. And one of the primary materials is straw. Straw is good because it's usually affordable. So whether it's wheat straw or oat straw, The machine comes and harvests the material. Usually that's fed to animals. And then the leftover is the straw. That's usually collected and then sold. And people use it for all kinds of things. The bedding for animals. You will see it at the pumpkin patch, or you can get a bale and use it in the compost pile. It lasts a long time. It's very dry. There's no seeds, and it breaks down quickly because there's no woody material. And as the name suggests, straw is hollow inside, so it holds a lot of air as well. Some people like to take the straw and put it through a chipper or a shredder to make it even more fine. I personally find that to be unnecessary, but it all depends on your circumstance. And finally, we'll look at the high nitrogen material. These are the things people call greens because usually it's green. It's like the fresh plant material. And so anything from a kitchen, all the food scraps that you would throw into a compost pile, that's considered green material. Any plant material that falls from trees and has not dried off or oxidized in the environment, that's good. It's got a high nitrogen ratio. You could add non-plant material as high nitrogen. That includes manure, so animal manure. Classically, people would use farm animals, horses, cows, goats, chickens, rabbits. All that kind of manure is fine to add to the compost pile. You want to limit it, however. You don't want too much. If you have too much, you're going to have sodium or a lot of salt in your compost, which, if that builds up in your soil, can become toxic to plants. Additionally, if you put meat-eating animals or pet animals, dogs, cats, human manure into a compost pile, you have a greater chance of coming in contact with harmful pathogens. Things like E. coli, salmonella can make people sick. If they come into contact during the compost process, or even if that compost is applied improperly to a food growing setting, there's potential for harm. All sorts of potential things could be added, even animal products, meat, dairy, dead animals can be composted. It's fine to compost animal material. However, consider your setting. If you're in an urban environment in a backyard, a lot of people recommend do not put any animal products at all, because you're going to attract other things than microorganisms. You're going to attract animals, and you don't really want that causing a nuisance in the area. So let's look a little bit more closely at the carbon to nitrogen ratio. Ideally, the most efficient composting happens with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 25:1. What that means is you have 25 times as much carbon as you do nitrogen, and that's on an atomic level. The trouble with this ratio is it's difficult to calculate. And so you can see that the dry material, the high carbon material, would be things like sawdust, paper products, straw, dry leaves. Those are 500:1 in the most extreme form, but kind of 50 to 100:1 carbon to nitrogen. So if we compare that to the high nitrogen material, we have food waste, grass clippings, manure, kitchen scraps, all kinds of different products, including alfalfa hay. And you can see that the carbon to nitrogen ratio is below 25:1. So if we mix the high nitrogen and the high carbon, most of the time you're going to end up very close to 25:1. So you don't really need to worry too much. And if something doesn't seem like it's working, well, you're going to either add more high carbon material or more high nitrogen material as a ratio. Most people, if they're composting on a home scale, will have plenty of green material or high nitrogen, because you are composting food scraps from a kitchen, and you'll then need to go out and acquire enough high carbon material to balance out the compost pile and help it reach an optimal ratio. And that's where you go and purchase a bale of straw. That's your easiest, simplest, cheapest way to do it. And whenever you add food to the pile, you add some straw. And if you do that over time, it's going to work. It's going to break down and decompose. Now let's talk for a moment about the temperature in the compost pile. A lot of people think the temperature comes from the sun, or that the temperature is an indicator that it's working. Well, both of those are only partially true. If it's in full sun, yeah, you'll have a little bit higher temperature, but mainly the temperature is caused by the microorganisms down in the pile. And does it need to be any certain temperature in order to decompose? No, it will decompose at any temperature. However, when it does reach a hot temperature, then we have pathogen reduction, and we also have the elimination of weed seeds. So most municipal compost has a requirement that it should be above a certain temperature for a certain amount of time. So here we can say that certain ratios of material will enable the microorganisms to work at a rate that will heat up the pile. Active management of the pile, like turning, is needed to maintain sufficient supply of oxygen and the right moisture level. The air-water balance is critical to maintaining high temperatures between 130 and 160 degrees Fahrenheit until the materials are broken down. So if you are engaged in active composting, that means you're turning and adding water in order to keep the temperatures high. And high temperatures equal quick compost. And if you're engaged in passive composting, you're not turning and you're not adding water, you're allowing nature to take its own course, and the temperature will most likely stay below 130, and it will still decompose, but it'll go more slowly. Active composting will go through 3 general phases, and they can be categorized based on their temperature. So the initial phase is mesophilic. So you build the compost pile until it really becomes very active with microorganisms. The temperature will stay moderate, basically similar to ambient air temperature. And the certain types of organisms present will be mesophilic. They will be organisms that are operating under those types of ambient temperatures. As the mesophilic microorganisms find it to be a hospitable place, they will increase in numbers and they will give way to the second phase. The second phase is a thermophilic phase. And basically enough organisms have come to the party that they start producing a lot of heat. They produce so much heat that different species tend to thrive under these high temperature conditions. And so these organisms are known as thermophilic. And this is where the real bulk of the decomposition is carried out under these high temperatures. And then finally, as the material becomes consumed and the resources become exhausted, the temperature will once again decrease. And as the temperature decreases, the proportion of mesophilic organisms will rise once again, and you'll enter a maturation phase. A lot of times they call this the curing process. So the temperature rises, the stuff breaks down, and then you let it sit for a little while so that it cures and just becomes a little more refined and loses its heat. And then it will become stable and ready to apply to the landscape. Let's take a look at those microorganisms and understand a little bit more about them. So the primary organism in the compost is bacteria. Bacteria is the most numerous of all the microorganisms, and bacteria is literally found all over the planet. Depending on the phase of composting, it's either mesophilic or thermophilic bacteria, and there are many different species, and there are many individuals within that species. A large majority of the material is made up and produced by bacteria. There's a certain subset of bacteria called actinobacteria. Used to be referred to as actinomycete because it is a filamentous bacteria, and people used to think that it was a fungus or a fungal mycelium, actinomycete. But under further examination, it's kind of a separate thing. It's not quite a bacteria, not quite a fungus, but it's referred to as actinobacteria. And it plays a special role in the compost pile of breaking down wood products like newspaper and bark. In particular, it will be the organism that produces that earthy smell in a compost and in soil. And then there are fungi, molds, and yeast that help to break down materials that the bacteria cannot, especially the lignin in the woody material. So if you have a lot of bark and trees, especially thick wood, bacteria doesn't break that down. And so only the fungi can do that. The material in plants is either cellulose or lignin, and lignin in particular is found in woody plants. And if you add a lot of lignin, then you'll have more fungi in your soil. Also, the amount of fungi in the soil is dependent on the general temperatures and conditions. A little bit more moisture helps to encourage fungi, and a lower temperature will also favor fungi. And some environments naturally favor fungi. In San Diego, with a dry Mediterranean climate, we usually have fewer fungi in a compost pile. And if you wanted to get extra, you would need to have it be extra wet and try to keep the temperatures on the cool side. In general, however, anything you find in a compost pile is good. You don't need to worry about it. You don't need to try to keep anything out of the compost pile, because everything is there to do a job of decomposing. And then we start to have little arthropods and little insects and animals, things like protozoa, rotifers, single-celled organisms. These are very important in the compost. What they do is they feed on bacteria and fungi and other small organisms. And then when they poop them out, they are releasing them in a water-soluble form that is available to your plants. A lot of people wonder about worms. Do you need to add the worms? No, you don't need to add worms. There is a certain type of composting that is done just with worms. Oftentimes it's referred to as vermicompost, vermiculture. And it basically is a lower temperature. It's a mesophilic compost pile and stays a little bit more wet. The worms, they consume the material, they consume the bacteria on the material, it passes through their body, and what's left behind is a casting, worm casting. That's the manure of the worm, and it's the end product of the breakdown of organic matter by earthworms. It contains very rich diversity of microbes and lots of water-soluble nutrients. There's several species of earthworms that you can use. The primary species is the red worm or the red wiggler. And in nature, that one lives in the leaf litter on the forest floor. And so its diet consists of 100% organic matter. It consumes organic material quite quickly. And so if you've got a pound of worms, at least a half pound a day of organic material can be processed by the worms. Their population will rise and fall based on how much material is given to them to eat. And so it's quite a robust system that's easy to manage. A lot of people like to have this at home as a simple kind of addition to a standard compost pile, because you gain access to the high value byproducts, the earthworm castings, and all of those minerals and microbes found within. You can take the finished product of composts, whether it's standard compost or the worm compost, vermicompost, and you can add value to it by creating what's known as compost tea. Now, compost tea has an interesting name. Don't worry, it's not for humans to drink. So you're not going to drink compost tea, hopefully. But it's basically taking the high value minerals and the living organisms that are present in finished compost. And then you can add that to water with oxygen, and you can grow the biology, you can grow the population into the volume of water that you add. So compost tea is a water-based, oxygen-rich culture containing large populations of beneficial aerobic bacteria, nematodes, fungi, and protozoa, which can be used to bioremediate toxins. Compost tea is different from the leachate. The leachate is anything that drips off of finished compost or even unfinished compost. That liquid that collects at the bottom is known as leachate. That's usually anaerobic. And while there may be valuable minerals there, you often want to dilute that product if you ever use it, because it can contain harmful pathogens and even some alcohol material that is not going to be helpful to plants. The difference with compost tea is it's actively aerated. It's a valuable thing for growers, especially organic growers, because it's easy and cheap to make. It's a good source of beneficial bacteria and fungi. You're going to need access to dechlorinated water, oxygen, and agitation. You can make it by hand, but most people will make it with a little pump and pump oxygen into water. And it's fairly simple. Ideally, it gets applied to the landscape within a day or two so that it has the ability to stay aerobic and not die out due to lack of oxygen. Thermophilic composting is well known to destroy many seeds and nearly all types of pathogens. There are exceptions, and the sanitizing qualities of thermophilic composting are desirable where there's a high likelihood of pathogens, such as with manure. Now, a lot of people wonder, can I put diseased plant material or weed seeds into the compost? Sure you can. The question is that a problem? And for most people, I say, no, it's not a problem. You're going to kill a lot of them by putting them in the compost pile. There's a chance you won't kill all of them. However, where did those weeds come from? They came from the landscape in which you're composting. And so you don't want to introduce anything new, but if it came from that area, it's fine to compost it and return the compost to that area, because I guarantee you there's already seeds out there, weed seeds. Additionally, the diseased plant material is going to be broken down to an extent that those diseases are very unlikely to survive the compost and then be reapplied to your plants. The only other thing I would typically recommend leaving out of the compost pile is anything spiny with thorns or spikes, simply because I would prefer not to encounter those spiky materials later when I'm working with the compost. But even those, if you didn't care, it would be fine to put them in the compost as well. Now let's talk about application. Compost can be tilled directly into the soil. It is organic matter, and that's an important component of healthy soil. Generally, direct seeding into compost is not recommended. If you just have pure compost and only compost, the plants do not do so well. The structure is not appropriate, and the water and air qualities are not proper for plant growth. You want to mix the compost with mineral soil, sand, silt, and clay. And once those two are combined, then the structure behaves quite nice. If you're transplanting seedlings, you can use a mixture of 20 to 30% compost and mineral-based soil. Oftentimes sand would work well. If the plants are already existing in the ground, you want to apply the compost on the surface. You can apply it directly as mulch and not till it in. Over time, it may work its way down, or you can lightly scratch the compost into the top layer of soil. And in nature, that's where compost gets applied. The leaves, they fall from the trees, they decompose at the surface of the soil in the O or organic horizon, and the soluble minerals work their way down to the root zone. So it's fine to apply compost that way too. You don't need to dig compost really deeply down into the soil. And if you're building, for example, a raised bed garden box, you don't need to fill the whole thing with compost. Just the top 6 inches is where you want to amend with compost. And that's where the primary layer of your roots are going to be, looking for all the soluble minerals that are there to be found. You can apply compost every year to your plants. Just usually for mature trees and shrubs, you apply it around the drip zone, which would be the outer edge of the branches. You don't necessarily want to put it on too thick as top dressing to a turf grass or a lawn. 1/4 inch as a layer once a year is fine. If you go thicker than that, it's going to potentially kill the grass. But yeah, you can apply compost to grass, to trees, to shrubs, to vegetables. You can mix it up with a potting mix, put it in potted plants. So there's virtually no place compost cannot go. And remember, it's just a part of healthy soil. So you could even give it away with a clean conscience, or you could kind of work it into some soil, urban soil that needs amending, and you won't be causing any problems. There's never a shortage of places to apply compost. So there we go. There's our talk all about compost. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I hope this gives you some guidance if you're going to be composting at home or for a client. And you can really scale this up to be a profession. You can be a professional composter. You can make compost on a commercial scale, or you can scale it down to the individual, and you can do small scale composting on an apartment balcony or a patio. There's every type of solution in between. Ultimately, it's a natural process. We're not doing the composting. We just create the conditions that enable the decomposers to work at an optimum speed and produce a product that we can apply to growing plants. It's a very important skill that goes hand in hand with all types of plant growing, is recycling the plant material back into a component of healthy soil.